There was a time when there was no time, before pyramids and pharaohs, before the Nile flowed north or south, before even the idea of direction. The universe was a vast ocean of silence. This ocean was not filled with fish or salt or even waves. It was a conceptual ocean, a formless expanse the Egyptians called None. None was not a god in the human sense. He had no temples built to him, no festivals in his name, and very few offerings. He was too old for all that, too abstract. He was the absence of everything and the potential of everything at once. None was the backdrop to reality, and yet it is from this watery boredom that everything began. While other mythologies might begin with explosions or divine wars, the Egyptian creation myth begins with stillness. None is a quiet, patient chaos, not violent or malicious. He exists outside of time and place. His waters represent primordial potential, like a library of unwritten books. The ancient Egyptians were obsessed with ordermat, the principle of cosmic balance. But to value order, one must first recognize disorder. None, therefore, is not evil. He is the unshaped clay. Eventually, from this watery potential rose a single mound. It was called the Benbana, small rise of earth, not unlike what one might see after a particularly low flood. The Egyptians, who lived and died by the cycles of the Nile, imagined creation not as divine lightning or birth pangs, but as something familiar and slow, a steady rising of mud from water. Upon this first mound stood Adam, the first god. Adam was everything and nothing. He had no parents, no creator. He emerged from none, fully formed by the power of his own will. In some stories, he creates himself by naming himself, potent reminder of how much the Egyptians valued the act of naming. Adam is often linked with the sun god Ra, but here he appears alone, with no throne or court. He is the solitary spark of being in a vast ocean of unbeing, and he was alone. It is worth pausing to understand what Adam represents, not glory or conquest, but existence itself. His creation is not dramatic, it is administrative. Adam begins the process of populating reality, like someone filling out a divine census without a partner. Adam had to create his first children alone, and so he did. According to the myth, he either sneezed or spat out the first two deities, Shu, god of air, and Tefnut, goddess of moisture. Yes, creation by bodily function. To the modern mind, this may seem undignified, even absurd. But for the ancient Egyptians, these acts were not disgusting. They were mysterious mechanisms of life. Saliva, breath, and tears were symbols of energy and divine essence. Every bodily function had spiritual significance. They were the stuff of gods. Shu and Tefnut represented the first differentiation: air and moisture, sky and atmosphere, the very ingredients that would make space livable, breathable. Their existence allowed things to separate, to define themselves. From unity came duality. From duality, complexity. But there was a problem. After their creation, Shu and Tefnut left their father to explore the dark, chaotic waters of Nun. Adam, having created them, now experienced the first emotion not yet present in the universe: worry. He searched for them in the black waters, calling their names. Here, the myth becomes eerily personal. The God who created himself and the first elements of the universe was now alone again. fearing the loss of his only companions. Eventually, Shu and Tefnut returned, and Adam wept with joy. From his tears literal and symbolic sprang humans, yes. Humanity was born from the tears of a relieved God, not from rage or pride or blood, but from a moment of parental vulnerability. The Egyptians would remember this in their funerary practices. Tears were not to be hidden, they were powerful, they honored the gods. Unlike many dramatic myths of thunder and conquest, this one moves like sediments, lowly, meaningfully. It mattered deeply to Egyptian priests and scribes who spent lifetimes copying out hymns to Adam, Shu, and Tefnut. They knew that in these boring beginnings lay the foundation of everything else. The temple at Heliopolis, a religious center now buried beneath modern Cairo, once held a sacred stone believed to be the original Benbon. Priests there guarded the myth of Adam with bureaucratic dedication. Rituals repeated the story daily to remind the world that order must always rise from chaos, that every day is a little act of creation in their worldview. Even the dullest moment was a sacred repetition of the first dawn. As you listen now, drifting through this old tale, imagine how ancient Egyptians thought of silence, not as emptiness, but as latent life. To them, the quiet hours before sunrise were like the time before Adam emerged, full of potential, thick with sacred weight. Their world was governed by such invisible details. The rituals of lighting lamps, burning incense, sweeping temple floors. These were not chores, but microcosmic versions of creation. In the myth, Adam did not conquer anything. He did not slay monsters. He did not rage against darkness. He organized it. Creation in Egyptian mythology is not a moment, it is a process. And that process began with a god standing alone on a mound of earth, in a sea of quiet possibility. And in that moment, before land, sky, sun, or tomb, he began to shape the world with nothing but himself. But how did Shu and Tefnut, gods of air and moisture, go on to shape the first cosmic structures of sky and earth? How did their children and the grandchildren of Adambig to populate the world with complexity? And what was the price of order in a world still soaked with chaos? The world as you know it was not always a neatly divided landscape of earth, sky, and river. For the Egyptians, that separation itself was an act of divine struggle. The beginning was not fire and lightning, but suffocation and space making. We left Adam with his first children, Shu air and Tefnut moisture. From their union, a second generation of gods emerged, representing what humans most easily recognize, the land beneath their feet and the sky above their heads. These were Geb, earth, and Nut, sky, and yet this arrangement was not as orderly as it sounds. In the beginning, Geb and Nut were inseparable. The myths describe them locked in an eternal embrace, earth and sky pressed tightly together, leaving no room for anything in between. Imagine the entire universe squeezed flat, airless, and dark. This closeness was not mere affection. It was a problem. In their tight embrace, there was no space for life to grow. Humanity, animals, plants, all the complexity of the world had no room to breathe. The primordial world was stifled by intimacy. Adam, the first god, recognized this. But it was Shu, their father, who acted. Shu, god of air, performed what was perhaps the most critical act in Egyptian cosmology. He forced himself between Geb and Nut, stretching his arms. He pried them apart, raising Nut into the sky and pressing Geb down as the earth. His body, representing air, became the eternal space that kept them divided. This act of separation was not done in anger, but necessity. Without Shu, the world would remain a compressed union of potential, unable to flourish. His role was not glamorous. It was a maintenance role, like the beam in a ceiling that prevents collapse. Shu was the architecture of order itself. In Egyptian temples, this separation was reenacted symbolically. Ceilings painted blue, with stars represented Nut, stretched overhead, while the floors of stone represented Geb. Every temple, every shrine, was a microcosm of this first act of architecture. Sky above, earth below, air in between. Nut was not a vague dome but a personal being. She was often painted as a woman, stretching her body over the horizon, her hands and feet touching the edges of the earth. She arched over Geb like a protective canopy, her skin studded with stars. The Egyptians saw her as mother of many gods, including Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. But even before motherhood, Nut symbolized a boundary. Every night she swallowed the sun, and every morning she gave birth to it again. Her body was the great cycle of day and night. The image of Nut swallowing the sun was not terrifying, it was routine. The Egyptians understood life as cycles, not as linear progressions. Death itself was part of this cycle, a temporary swallowing. Before rebirth, Geb, meanwhile, lay beneath her, flat and fertile. His body was the soil, the source of crops, the platform upon which temples and tombs were built. Unlike the violent earth gods of other mythologies, Geb was passive. He did not rage or shake mountains. He was steadfast. Farmers prayed to him indirectly each year as the Nile flooded and receded. They saw in Geb's body the grounding principle of life, stability. Without his patient endurance, the sky's grandeur and the air's vitality would have no resting place. But here is where the myth takes on a quietly tragic note. The separation imposed by Shu was painful. Geb and Nut longed for each other, straining across the vast space of air. Their desire to reunite became a cosmic tension, the push and pull of creation. This longing was not destructive, it was productive. The space between them gave birth to life. The Egyptians did not see tragedy in this separation, but necessity. Out of the ache of distance, humanity and the natural world came into being. Think of the metaphor. Without separation, there is no individuality, no growth. Without boundaries, all becomes suffocation. Shu's act reminds us that sometimes stability requires distance. Egyptian priests took this myth into their architecture. Every temple was a recreation of creation itself. The floor represented Geb, the ceiling, painted with Nut, represented the heavens. Columns carved like papyrus or lotus plants symbolized the first vegetation that sprouted when earth and sky were parted. The temple was not just a place of worship, it was a cosmic machine. Every ritual performed inside was a rehearsal of keeping order intact. If priests failed to perform their duties, the Egyptians feared that Nut and Geb might collapse back together, suffocating existence. It is important to understand that Egyptian mythology was not about drama, but about order. The chaos of Nun never disappeared. It lingered beyond the edges of creation, threatening to swallow it back at any moment. Every sunrise was a small victory against collapse. Every ritual a defense. And so the myth of separation was not just a story, but a daily concern. Keeping Geb and Nut apart was as important as keeping the Nile on its course, or as maintaining the temple calendar. The myth continues with the children of this separated pair. Nut, despite being stretched high above Geb, bore children, Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. These would become the central figures of later Egyptian mythology, embroiled in dramas of inheritance, betrayal, and resurrection. But even here, the story lingers on the mundane. Their births were not straightforward. Adam, fearing the potential of these new gods, cursed Nut so that she could not give birth on any day of the year. Only by trickery did she find a loophole, creating 5 extra days beyond the 360-day calendar. These became the epigomenal days, tacked on to the year to allow life itself to continue. Think of the bureaucratic elegance of this solution. The universe itself adjusted its calendar for the birth of gods. The Egyptians lived their lives in the gap between Geb and Nut. Their houses had flat roofs under the open sky. Their fields stretched across Geb's body, and their daily prayers rose into Shu's air. Existence itself was understood as life between boundaries. To them, boredom was sacred. The endless cycle of sunrise and sunset, the routine of flood and planting, the repetition of rituals, all of this was a reflection of that first cosmic separation. When you lie awake at night, looking at the ceiling, you are, without realizing it, reenacting an Egyptian truth. The separation of ceiling and floor is the architecture of life. Without that distance, there is no space to breathe, to dream, to live. So too with Geb and Nut. Their eternal yearning is the cost of life. Their distance is our possibility. This separation, though necessary, raised new questions. If Geb and Nut gave birth to Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys, how would these gods live within the order already established? Would their dramas continue the work of creating structure, or would they threaten to undo the fragile balance Shu had imposed? And if the world required constant maintenance, what would happen when the vigilance of gods or humans faltered? Even for a moment, the Egyptians believed that once Nut, the sky, was lifted above Geb, the earth, there was room for children to be born. From their union came 4 of the most important figures in Egyptian mythology: Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. Their story is not just a family drama. It is the framework upon which Egyptian religion rested for millennia. And like all things Egyptian, it begins not with war or spectacle, but with a calendar problem. The myth says that Adam, the first god, or sometimes Ra, declared that Nut would not give birth on any day of the year. At this time, the Egyptian calendar was 360 days long. To prevent chaos, the gods kept to their schedules with mathematical precision, but Nut, longing to bring forth her children, turned to Thoth, god of wisdom, writing, and calculation. Was not a warrior or a king. He was a scribe, and like all scribes, he found solutions, not with force, but with cleverness. Thoth gambled with the moon, and won 5 additional days of light. These epigomenal days existed outside the regular year, days without destiny, days unclaimed by order. On each of these days, Nut gave birth: Osiris on the first day, Horus the elder on the second, a figure distinct from the later falcon Horus, Set on the third, Isis on the fourth, Nephthys on the fifth. These births populated the world with gods whose stories would fill temples, hymns, and tomb inscriptions for centuries. Osiris was the eldest and most important. He embodied fertility, vegetation, and the cycles of agriculture. Farmers associated him with the Nile's annual flooding, which brought both death and renewal destruction of old fields, followed by new fertility. He was imagined as a just king, the first to rule Egypt. His governance was not fierce but orderly. Much like the Egyptian worldview itself, he brought agriculture, taught humans how to cultivate wheat, and offered the knowledge of wine-making. Osiris, single quotes, as rain represented what Egyptians valued most: stability, nourishment, and the quiet rhythm of life. Isis, sister and wife of Osiris, was revered as a goddess of magic, healing, and protection. Unlike other goddesses who might fade into obscurity, Isis's cult grew to span the Mediterranean world, even into Roman times. She was known for her resourcefulness, her ability to weave spells, and her fierce loyalty to her family. Her role was not glamorous in the sense of conquest. Rather, she embodied devotion and domestic power. In the Egyptian household, women found in her a divine ally who governed love, childbirth, and survival through intelligence rather than force. Set, the third-born, represented chaos, storms, and the desert. He was not originally a villain. In early myths, he was even celebrated for his strength. Egyptians saw the desert as both threatening and necessary. It was a barrier that protected the fertile Nile Valley from invasion. Set embodied the untamed, the unpredictable, but in these early moments, he symbolized a truth the Egyptians accepted: order and chaos must coexist. The desert and the river, the storm and the flood, were all parts of the same balance. The youngest Nephthys lived in the margins. She was the goddess of boundaries, twilight, and things hidden. Unlike Isis, she was not widely worshipped, and, unlike Set, she was not feared. Instead, she embodied the unnoticed spaces, funerary rituals, laments, and the quiet presence of endings. Priests saw her as essential in mourning rites, where she stood alongside Isis as a weeper for Osiris. She represented the necessary sadness in the cycle of life. Together, these siblings represented the complexity of Egyptian life: Osiris, fertility, kingship, and rebirth; Isis, protection, loyalty, and magic; Set, chaos, strength, and unpredictability; Nephthys, boundaries, mourning, and the overlooked. This was no random grouping. It was a divine family reflecting the daily realities of Egypt: fertility and barrenness, loyalty and betrayal, order and chaos, mourning and renewal. The myth of Osiris's murder by Set belongs to later elaborations, but the seeds of that story are here. Set, associated with desert and storms, contrasted sharply with Osiris, the green of fields and rivers. Where Osiris represented nourishment, Set symbolized threat. Their tension was not just personological: river versus desert, flood versus drought, life versus death. Egyptians did not see these as opposites to be destroyed, but as forces to be managed. Still, in myth, the tension took on narrative form. Osiris's eventual death at Set's hands would become the central myth of Egyptian religion. retold in funerary texts for thousands of years. For Egyptians listening to these stories, the divine family was not abstract. Their own lives mirrored the balance between the siblings. Farmers worked Osiris's fertile lands, while fearing Set's desert winds. Women invoked Isis in childbirth. Funerary priests mourned with Nephthys at every tomb. The gods were not distant. They were reflections of daily existence. By this stage in the myth, creation was not complete but ongoing. Nun, the primordial chaos, still surrounded the world. Shu still held Nut above Geb, and the children of earth and sky brought new complexities, loyalties, rivalries, and the seeds of conflict. Egyptian mythology never allowed order to be taken for granted. It was always under maintenance, just as priests repeated rituals daily to keep Mot order alive. So too did the gods enact stories that preserved balance. What may feel uneventful to Us gods born on extra calendar days, a scribe god gambling with the moon, a separation enforced by a god of air was, to the Egyptians, the most profound drama imaginable. It was not the spectacle of thunderbolts, but the quiet structuring of reality. Even in boredom, they found sacred meaning. A farmer sowing barley reenacted Osiris. A mourner at a funeral echoed Nephthys. A storm across the desert was Set's presence. Every detail of life was folded into this divine family. And so we arrive at the end of the first story of creation. The primordial waters receded into the background. The first mound rose. Adam created the air and moisture, who gave rise to earth and sky. And from their union came the four gods, who would define Egyptian mythology. But this raises an unresolved question. If order required constant vigilance, and if chaos was always waiting at the edges, how secure was this cosmic balance? Would the divine family preserve stability, or would their rivalries threaten to collapse the fragile space Shu created? And if gods themselves could falter, what hope did ordinary humans have of keeping Mat intact? When an Egyptian died, their life did not simply end, nor did it transform immediately into paradise or punishment. Instead, the soul entered a long, measured process. For the Egyptians, death was not a door you walked through. It was a waiting room filled with paperwork, judges, and procedures. At the center of this process was Mat, the goddess and principle of cosmic order. She was not a warrior or a ruler, but a symbol, a single feather, light and precise. That feather was more powerful than armies or kings, for it weighed the hearts of the dead. Mat was not just a goddess. She was a concept. She represented truth, balance, justice, and the structure of the universe. Egyptians believed the sun rose each morning and the Nile flooded each year because Mat was in place. She was the glue of reality. Pharaohs were said to uphold Mat, meaning their duty was not conquest or glory, but the preservation of balance. When a ruler governed fairly, society prospered. When he failed, famine or invasion followed not as punishment, but as a collapse of cosmic order. In daily life, Mat appeared in contracts, court cases, and even grain measurements. Fairness was not abstract. It was as concrete as the weight of a stone. The Egyptian afterlife began with a journey. The deceased, now called the Ka, life force, and Ba, soul personality, traveled through the Duatha underworld. This was not a fiery hell, but a complicated landscape filled with gates, guardians, and obstacles to pass through. The soul needed spells and passwords. These were provided by the Book of the Dead, a collection of texts buried with the deceased. The book was less a story and more a manual, instructions on what to say, when to bow, and how to address each deity encountered along the way. It was, in essence, a bureaucratic guidebook. The soul moved through checkpoints, much like a traveler showing papers at customs. At the climax of this journey stood the most famous scene in Egyptian funerary belief, the weighing of the heart. The deceased entered the Hall of Two Truths, where 42 divine judges sat in attendance. In the center was a great scale. On one side lay the heart of the deceased, believed to contain every deed, thought, and memory of their life. On the other side lay the feather of Mot. If the heart balanced with the feather, the soul was declared pure and admitted to the eternal fields. If it weighed heavier, burdened by lies, injustice, or greed, the heart was devoured by Ammit, a monstrous creature with the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. This was not eternal torment. It was worse, in Egyptian terms, non-existence. The soul ceased to be before the weighing. The deceased recited the negative confessions, also known as the declarations of innocence. These were not pleas but denials. I have not stolen. I have not lied. I have not polluted the Nile. I have not slain the sacred cattle. There were 42 such statements, one for each judge. Each confession matched a specific moral or ritual concern. Together, they formed a catalogue of daily order. The negative confessions were not about extraordinary sins, but ordinary conduct. The Egyptians cared less about spectacular crimes and more about the boring responsibilities of life: honesty in trade, respect for neighbors, care for fields, and reverence for temples. In this sense, the afterlife trial was not foreign. It was a reflection of everyday Egyptian bureaucracy. Just as scribes recorded grain, officials measured labor, and priests counted offerings, so too did the gods measure the soul. No trial was complete without records. In the Hall of Two Truths, the god Thoth, depicted with the head of an ibis, acted as court scribe. He recorded the outcome of the weighing with meticulous detail. Thoth did not judge or punish. He documented. His role reflected the Egyptian belief that writing preserved truth itself. A verdict was not real until written. To be remembered was to exist. To be unrecorded was to fade. Thus, Thoth's presence ensured that justice was permanent. Etched into the cosmic archive, overseeing the hall was Osiris, god of the afterlife, seated on a throne. Once a king on earth, Osiris now ruled the eternal fields. His presence in the court signaled that death was not an end, but a continuation of order under divine kingship. For Egyptians, Osiris was not a distant figure. They identified deeply with his myth of death and resurrection. To be judged by him was to participate in the same cycle he endured: death, dismemberment, and eventual renewal. The weighing of the heart was less about morality in a modern sense and more about proportion. Egyptians did not expect perfection. They expected alignment with Mat. A person might have failed in small ways, but could still pass if their heart was fundamentally balanced. This concept reflects Egyptian architecture, art, and governance. Symmetry was prized. Balance was beauty. Injustice was not just wrong, it was ugly, disproportionate, heavy. What strikes modern listeners is the ordinariness of this system. Unlike the dramatic torments of other afterlives, the Egyptian judgment focused on the mundane. Did you lie? Did you cheat? Did you neglect offerings? Life was preparation, not for glory, but for accountability. Every small act measuring grain, fairly sweeping temple floors, respecting neighbors became part of one's eternal record. In this way, boredom itself became sacred. The daily grind was rehearsal for the cosmic trial. There was one more detail that troubled Egyptians. The heart could betray its owner. Some texts describe the heart speaking out of turn, revealing truths the deceased hoped to hide, to prevent. This, the heart scarab amulet, was placed on mummies, inscribed with a spell. "O my heart, do not stand up against me as a witness." This reveals a deep anxiety. Even in death, the Egyptians feared not punishment from gods, but betrayal by their own conscience. If successful, the deceased entered the field of Ridza, perfected version of Egypt itself. There they plowed fields, ate bread, and sailed boats forever. Paradise was not clouds or palaces, but the familiar life of farming and fishing. Without hunger or illness, it was not exciting. It was idealized routine, the boring comforts of a world perfectly balanced. This entire vision of judgment reveals the Egyptian worldview, that survival depends not on heroic deeds, but on daily order. The gods were not interested in ambition or glory. They cared about balance, fairness, and truth. And so the weighing of the heart was less a trial than a continuation of life's bureaucracy, a cosmic extension of the same order that governed Nile floods and temple rituals. But here we pause. The weighing of the heart seemed absolute. Yet, could the outcome be influenced? Did prayers from the living, or spells from the Book of the Dead, alter the scales? And if the heart itself might betray, how secure was anyone in their eternal judgment? The Egyptians lived with this tension, certainty in the process, but uncertainty in the result. The weighing of the heart is often remembered as a single moment a soul, a feather, and a scale. But for the Egyptians, this moment was not the work of one god alone. It was a collective trial, presided over by a panel of 42 judges, each responsible for a different aspect of truth. This detail reveals much about Egyptian thought. Justice was not personal, but bureaucratic. It was distributed across a system, like an administrative court, where every official checked a single detail. Each of the judges presided over one of Egypt's nomes, or provinces. Their names survive in funerary texts, strange to the modern ear, but significant. He who comes from the lake of fire, crusher of bones. He who lives on entrails. Each judge heard one of the negative confessions. The deceased addressed them one by one. To the judge of Heliopolis, "I have not spoken lies." To the judge of Hermopolis, "I have not caused pain." To the judge of Memphis, "I have not stolen temple goods." The trial was not about dramatic crimes. It was about small obligations, grain owed to the temple, truth spoken in the market, respect shown to neighbors. The judges' multiplicity mirrored the Egyptian state itself, divided into nomes, administered by officials, recorded by scribes. Just as every village reported to higher authorities, every human reported to these divine bureaucrats. This system of judgment reflected earthly politics. Pharaohs ruled as guardians of Mat, Their legitimacy did not rest solely on conquest, but on the claim that they maintained balance. In royal inscriptions, pharaohs boasted less about slaughtering enemies and more about feeding the people, restoring temples, and ensuring the Nile's proper flooding. Their achievements were measured not by expansion but by stability. A weak ruler threatened droughts, invasions, or rebellions were interpreted not merely as political failures but as cosmic cracks. Just as a heavy heart failed the scales, so too did a negligent king fail his nation. Temples across Egypt functioned as more than sacred spaces. They were also judicial centers. Priests acted as judges in disputes, weighing arguments like Osiris weighed hearts. Cases included inheritance, quarrels, boundary disputes, or accusations of theft. Witnesses swore oaths in the name of Mat. To lie under such an oath was to place one's own soul in jeopardy before the cosmic scales. Thus, daily law was infused with afterlife imagery. Every villager knew that cheating a neighbor in grain today might unbalance their heart tomorrow. Scribes recorded these proceedings, much like Thoth in the Hall of Two Truths. Their presence reinforced the idea that truth was not just spoken, it had to be documented. Egyptian culture tied permanence to writing. Stone inscriptions and papyrus documents outlasted memory. A false judgment could be forgotten if unwritten, but once recorded, it shaped destiny. This reliance on record-keeping mirrored the afterlife. Thoth's inscription of the weighing made it real, just as a scribe's contract made a transaction binding. Unlike dramatic myths of thunder gods and fiery punishments, Egyptian justice focused on the ordinary. The crime of stealing temple oil was as serious as murder. Polluting the Nile was as damning as violence. Why? Because, for Egyptians, order was fragile. A single broken law threatened the balance of the whole. The universe itself was imagined as a carefully maintained structure, vulnerable to collapse if neglected. This focus on the mundane gave Egyptian religion its unique, boring grandeur. Nothing was too small to matter. Ammit, the monster who ate heavy hearts, was not worshipped. She had no cult, no temple. She was not evil, but a function. Her role was to erase imbalance. Egyptians feared her, not because she tortured, but because she ended. Non-existence was the worst fate. No memory, no family offerings, no participation in the cycles of rebirth. This erasure reflected the Egyptian fear of being forgotten. To live was to be named, to be remembered, to leave inscriptions behind. To be consumed by Ammit was to vanish, leaving no trace in cosmic records. At was not a one-time decree. It was a daily task. Every sunrise was proof that Mat had been renewed. Every temple ritual reasserted her presence. Pharaohs offered small figurines of Mat to the gods during ceremonies, symbolizing their dedication to upholding order. The act itself was simple, presenting a small statue, but its meaning was immense. An eternal promise that balance would be kept. If order lapsed, chaos Isfit would creep back in. Isfit was not an external enemy, but the natural state of disorder. Without vigilance, the scales would tip for the common Egyptian. Living in accordance with Mat was both spiritual and practical. Farmers ensured fair divisions of water for irrigation. Merchants used standardized weights. Families honored the dead with offerings, so they would not fade into non-existence. Their morality was not abstract philosophy, but woven into routine. A just life was a life lived with fairness in grain measures, honesty in speech, and reverence for ritual. The afterlife trial, then, was not alien. It was simply the continuation of daily audits into eternity. It is striking that paradise, the field of reeds, offered little more than perfected routine, plowing without fatigue, eating without hunger, sailing without storms. This reveals the Egyptian view that boredom was sacred. The repetition of cycles was not dull, but divine. Order was not exciting, but it was eternal. To live forever in endless fields, sowing and harvesting under nuts' starry sky, was the ultimate reward, not because it thrilled, but because it never failed. Still, the system raised unease. If 42 judges demanded perfection in daily duties, could any person truly pass? Were prayers and funerary offerings enough to tip the balance? Texts like the Book of the Dead suggest that the Egyptians hoped so. Spells gave the deceased words of power, passwords to bypass obstacles, and charms to silence the heart. But reliance on spells reveals anxiety. If the system were perfectly fair, no cheat would be needed. The Egyptians seemed to know. Order was fragile, and even the most ordinary person could stumble. Here we pause again. If Mat was upheld through daily acts, what happened in times of crisis, when foreign armies invaded, when kings faltered? Did individual honesty still count, or did collective imbalance doom everyone? And if the scales of Mat governed eternity, could they ever truly remain balanced? Or was the threat of collapse always waiting just beyond the edge of order? The image of the feather and the heart, balanced on a scale, has lingered in human imagination for more than 3,000 years. Yet, for the Egyptians, this was never simply myth. It was the framework of their society, a system so deeply ingrained that daily life, politics, and cosmic order were indistinguishable. The story of Mat was not just about death. It was about survival, how to hold together a fragile world in which chaos always threatened to seep in. To Egyptians, Mat was the scaffolding of the universe. Without her, the sun would not rise, the Nile would not flood, and the stars would not stay in their patterns. She was not a warrior goddess defending order against an enemy. She was the structure itself. Her feather was a symbol of lightness, proportion, and correctness. It reminded people that life could not be too heavy with greed, too unbalanced with lies, or too distorted by injustice. To live against Mat was to risk tipping the scales, not only for oneself, but for the entire cosmos. Every pharaoh was called the Lord of Mat. His primary role was not conquest, but maintenance. In temple rituals, the king offered a small statue of Mat to the gods, as if to say, "I am keeping the world in balance on behalf of all Egyptians." In this way, political legitimacy was tied directly to cosmic stability. A good king was one under whom Mat flourished. The Nile flooded predictably, granaries were full, trade flowed. A failing king signaled imbalanced drought, unrest, invasion. Pharaoh was therefore not just ruler, but custodian of reality itself. Ordinary Egyptians also lived within this framework. Farmers divided irrigation channels fairly, so neighbors' fields received equal water. Merchants used official weights and measures. Judges in villages invoked Mat when settling disputes. Every small action was a reflection of cosmic order. A farmer who cheated in grain might think he had gained in the moment, but he had, in fact, unbalanced his own heart against the feather. Even funerary offerings were acts of Mat. Families visited tombs to provide food and recite prayers, ensuring the dead were remembered. Neglecting ancestors was seen as breaking balance, for memory itself was part of cosmic order. The opposite of Mat was Isfet, usually translated as chaos. Isfet was not an enemy god but the natural state of disorder, always threatening to return. The Egyptians believed the world had been created out of chaos and would dissolve back into it if order failed. Every sunrise, every flood, every ritual was a small defense against this collapse. Isfet appeared in droughts, invasions, betrayals, and lies. It was not spectacular evil, but imbalance, when things no longer aligned, when symmetry failed, when truth was lost. To keep Mat strong, Egyptians turned to ritual. Each morning, priests lit lamps in temples, swept floors, offered bread and beer, and recited hymns. These acts were not for entertainment. They were maintenance, the daily recreation of order. At dawn, the sun god Ra was believed to rise only because the priests had assisted him through ritual. Without these boring repetitions, the cycle might falter. The entire civilization was, in this sense, a machine for preventing collapse. Every person, from king to farmer, played a part in keeping Mat intact. The weighing of the heart was therefore not a distant myth, but a mirror of the Egyptian legal and political system. The 42 judges reflected the nomes and their officials. Thoth's record-keeping reflected scribal administration. Osiris as judge reflected the pharaoh as supreme ruler. The negative, confessions, reflected daily law and morality. The afterlife court was the eternal extension of Egypt's earthly bureaucracy. To live under Mat was to rehearse for judgment. Yet Egyptians were not naive. They knew balance was fragile. Famine, foreign conquest, or corrupt officials could upset Ma. Single quotes at texts reveal anxiety about the heart's betrayal, about Amit's looming jaws, about spells failing. Funerary amulets, like the heart scarab, were attempts to silence the heart, to guarantee fairness. This shows that Egyptians lived with attention, deep faith in Mat, but constant fear that it might slip away if the heart passed the scales. The reward was the field of reeds. Here, life continued much as before, plowing, harvesting, fishing, eating bread. But everything was perfected. No hunger, no pain, no illness. Paradise was not a dramatic reward, but an eternal routine. For Egyptians, this was ideal. The greatest gift was endless stability. To live forever in the balance of Mat was to escape the fear of Isfet. It was, in a sense, the divinization of boredom, eternal repetition as salvation. Though Egypt's temples and dynasties have long crumbled, the concept of Mat survives. The idea that justice is balance, that truth must be weighed, that law is tied to cosmic order. These ideas influenced later traditions. Even today, we speak of scales of justice, of balance in courts, of fairness as proportion. These are faint echoes of the feather of Mat, carried across centuries. Her legacy reminds us that stability, not spectacle, sustains societies. Order is fragile. Justice is routine. And survival depends not on grand deeds, but on the small fairnesses of daily life. So, the Egyptian afterlife was not about punishment or reward in the way later cultures imagined. It was about continuity. The scales ensured that the world beyond mirrored the world within. Yet, one cannot help but wonder, if the balance was always so fragile, what did it mean to live under such constant vigilance? Did Egyptians find comfort in the routine, or were they haunted by the possibility that even the smallest misstep could unbalance their eternity? And in our own lives, where justice still seeks balance, do we live closer to Mator, to Isfet? If you lived in ancient Egypt, every morning you would wake beneath the golden warmth of the sun. To you, the rising sun was not merely light in the sky. It was the visible body of a god. That god was Ra, the great solar deity, whose endless journey defined time itself. But Ra's story is not one of adventure or glory. It is one of routine. Each day he performed the same task, traveling across the sky in his solar boat, only to sink into the underworld at night, fight off dangers, and rise again in the morning. His life was a commute without end, an eternal repetition that mirrored the Egyptian devotion to cycles and balance. Ra was not simply a symbol. To the Egyptians, he was a living being, embodied in the blazing sun. He was imagined as a man with the head of a falcon, crowned with a solar disk, sometimes encircled by a cobra. His eyes were the sun itself, blazing across heaven. But unlike storm gods or warlike deities of other cultures, Ra's power was steady, predictable, and repetitive. His divinity was not expressed in sudden miracles, but in daily consistency. Every dawn was his birth, every dusk his death, and every night his struggle to return. This endless cycle defined Egyptian time, which was not linear but circular. Measured by the rhythm of the sun and the flood of the Nile, Ra's journey was imagined aboard a ship, the solar bark, called the Manjet, or morning boat during the day, and the Mesektet, or evening boat, at night. Each day, Ra sailed across the sky, accompanied by other gods who acted as crew. At night, he descended into the underworld, the Duat, navigating through 12 gates that represented the hours of darkness. This daily journey was both cosmic and bureaucratic. Each hour of night had its own guardian, challenges, and recitations. Just as a traveler might present papers at checkpoints, Ra and his crew had to utter the correct spells to pass through. Ra did not travel alone. The gods who accompanied him were essential to his survival. Sia, the god of perception, who, guided by awareness, Heka, the god of magic, who provided protective spells, Marat, sometimes seated beside Ara, ensuring his journey stayed in balance. These companions reveal that Ra's power alone was not enough. He relied on support, ritual, and order to maintain his path. Even the sun god needed a staff of assistance, an image deeply familiar to Egyptians living in a world run by administrators, scribes, and priests. The greatest danger to Ra's journey was the serpent Apophis Apep, a cosmic snake of chaos. Every night, Apophis attempted to swallow the solar boat, plunging the world into darkness forever. But Ra's companions fought him off with spears, spells, and fire. In some myths, Set, god of the desert and storms, served as Ra's defender, striking Apophis with his spear. The irony is notable. Chaos was repelled by chaos itself, showing that even disorder had its place in preserving balance. The Egyptians saw this battle not as a one-time victory, but as a nightly routine. Apophis was never destroyed. He returned every night. The struggle was eternal. Order was always temporary, always maintained through repetition. The Duat was not a fiery hell, but a dim, winding realm filled with rivers, caves, and strange beings. Each hour had its own guardian gods, each requiring proper rituals to appease. At the midpoint of the night, Ra merged with Osiris, god of the underworld. In this moment, the sun god, symbol of life, and Osiris, symbol of death, became one. This union represented the deepest truth of Egyptian belief. Life and death were not opposites, but phases of the same cycle. By dawn, Ra was reborn, rising from Nut's body as the morning sun. The world renewed itself once again. Egyptian temples were aligned with the sun's path. The temple at Karnak, for instance, was oriented so that the rising sun would shine directly through its axis during festivals. This architecture was not decorative. It was a way of syncing human ritual with Ra's cosmic commute. Priests reenacted Ra's journey daily. At dawn, they opened the sanctuary, unveiled the statue of the god, and presented offerings as if welcoming Ra back from his night voyage. At dusk, rituals prepared him for his descent into darkness. This repetition was not tiresome, it was essential. Without ritual, Egyptians feared Ra might fail in his journey, and the world would collapse into chaos. The Egyptians divided the day into hours, each marked by Ra's progress across the sky. Night, too, was divided into 12 stages, mirroring his passage through the Duat. Time itself was understood as Ra's journey. The clock was not an abstract invention, but a reflection of divine movement. Each day was a miniature creation, each night a miniature apocalypse, each dawn a miniature resurrection. The predictability of Ra's commute gave the Egyptians comfort. They knew that even when storms darkened the sky, Ra was still making his way across, still committed to returning. What strikes us today is how unexciting this story is when compared to other mythologies. There is no final triumph over Apophis, no permanent victory, no climax. Ra fights the same battle every night, wins, only to repeat it again. But to the Egyptians, this was the very essence of sacredness. Life was repetition. Farming meant planting and harvesting each year. Ritual meant repeating the same prayers every day. Existence itself was cyclical, not progressive. Ra's endless commute was not boring, it was reassuring. It told them that the world, though fragile, was dependable as long as order was maintained. As you listen to this story, you may feel the rhythm of Ra's journey echoing in your own life, the daily routines, the commutes, the repetition of tasks. For the Egyptians, such cycles were not dull but divine. Every sunrise was proof that order still held. Every sunset was a reminder of the struggle against chaos. Every dawn was a small miracle, achieved not through drama, but through routine persistence. But here we pause with a question. If Ra must fight Apophis every night, never destroying him, what does that mean for the future of the universe? Is there an end to the cycle, or is the world doomed to repeat forever, till one night Ra fails and the sun does not rise? When the sun slipped below the horizon in Egypt, the visible world darkened, but the Egyptians did not believe Ra had vanished. Instead, they imagined him traveling on, entering the Duat, the mysterious underworld, where he faced 12 gates and 12 hours of darkness before being reborn. This journey was not a metaphor for time, it was time itself. The Egyptians divided the night into 12 hours, each filled with specific landscapes, guardians, and rituals. Ra's progress was the clock by which the universe ticked. The journey began at sunset, when Ra entered the first gate of the underworld. This western gate was guarded by serpents and deities who demanded recognition. The solar boat needed to pass with the proper spells spoken by Saya perception and Heka magic. The deceased Egyptians, too, hoped to follow this path. Funerary texts instructed them to know the names of each gatekeeper, much like a traveler needing the correct passport stamps. Already, the tone was set. The journey was bureaucratic, procedural, dependent on precision. As Ra's boat glided deeper, the Duat became a river bordered by caverns. Souls of the dead waited along the banks, hoping for Ra's blessing. Some were rewarded with light, others remained in darkness. Here, Ra was not a conqueror, but a benefactor, distributing sunlight to the righteous. The Egyptians imagined their dead relatives in these regions, awaiting the sun god's glance to revive them for another cycle. Every cavern had guardians, each with names to be spoken. Forgetting a name meant delay, perhaps disaster. For Egyptians, this was a reflection of real life, paperwork incomplete, forms unsigned, processes delayed. At midnight, Ra reached the deepest and most mysterious moment of the journey. Here, he merged with Osiris, god of death and resurrection. This union was profound. Ra, symbol of life, and the daily cycle, met Osiris, symbol of permanence in death. For this moment, they were one, the eternal sun fused with the eternal king. The Egyptians saw this as the ultimate reconciliation. Life and death were not enemies, but two halves of the same whole. The living and the dead shared in this cycle. Farmers saw it in seeds buried in soil, sprouting again each year. Families saw it in funerary rituals, ensuring their dead participated in the sunrise. The midpoint was not a climax of drama, but of quiet fusion. It was the stillness of midnight, when everything was both most fragile and most assured. Apophis, the serpent of chaos, lay in wait. He attempted to halt the solar boat by swallowing the river, creating whirlpools, or coiling around the vessel. His very presence represented the threat of Isfitha undoing of order. Yet Apophis was never permanently defeated. Each night, gods on Ra's Crofin, including Set, paradoxically, the god of storms and disorder, speared him, cut him into pieces, or trapped him with spells. But he returned the next night, whole again. The Egyptians saw in this not futility, but truth. Chaos cannot be destroyed, only managed. Order is a daily struggle, not a permanent victory. As the boat sailed onward, the Duat began to brighten. The gods of the underworld hailed Ra, receiving his energy. The blessed dead rose briefly in his light, joining the company of gods. Here, the images in tombs show long processions of figures, gods, spirits, guardians lined up to receive the sun's passage. It was less a battle than an administrative roll call, every being awaiting recognition. This was Egyptian eternity, orderly, repetitive, regulated. Finally, Ra's boat reached the 12th hour. Nut, the sky goddess, awaited him. The solar boat entered her body, and Ra was reborn at dawn. This rebirth was not a surprise or a dramatic event. It was the expected conclusion. The sun would rise, because the cycle always completed. But the Egyptians never assumed it was guaranteed. Priests reenacted rituals each morning to ensure Ra emerged. Just as one might check documents before approving a shipment, the repetition itself was what gave comfort. Pharaohs, the walls of their tombs inscribed with detailed maps of the Duat, the Amduat, the Book of Gates, the Book of Caverns. These texts described each hour, each guardian, each spell. They were not decorative, they were literal guides, ensuring that the deceased king could follow Ra's journey. In death, the pharaoh was expected to join the solar boat, not as a spectator, but as a crew member. Ordinary people, too, placed small copies of such texts in their coffins, like miniature handbooks for the commute through eternity. Modern listeners may wonder, why repeat the same journey every night? Why imagine the sun, God failing, only to repeat the same struggle again? But for Egyptians, this was the point. Life was repetition, planting, harvesting, flooding, receding. Ritual was repetition, lighting lamps, reciting hymns, sweeping floors. Time itself was not progress, but cycles. Ra's endless commute mirrored the Egyptian worldview, stability through endless maintenance. The world survived, not because chaos was destroyed, but because order was endlessly renewed. When you think of Ra sailing through the underworld, do not imagine fireworks or battles of apocalypse. Imagine, instead, a night shift worker, clocking in every evening, repeating the same tasks, keeping the world running while others slept. Ra's greatness was not in victory, but in persistence. His nightly voyage was boring, predictable, and eternal. And that was precisely why it mattered. Yet, this raises an unsettling thought. If Ra depends on endless repetition, what happens if one night he fails? What if Apophis swallows the boat and the cycle ends? Is the universe truly eternal, or is every dawn a fragile victory that could, one day, fail to arrive? Ra's daily journey across the sky and through the underworld was more than myth. It was a structure that shaped Egyptian kingship, ritual, life, and even the way Egyptians imagined eternity. His endless commute was not simply cosmic routine, but the backbone of their civilization. The pharaoh was often called the son of Ra. This was not merely a metaphor for divine legitimacy. It meant the king's role mirrored Ra's, to maintain order through daily vigilance, just as Ra rose each morning, battled Apophis each night, and returned at dawn. So too was the pharaoh expected to perform his role tirelessly. Kingship was not about conquest or drama, it was about endurance. In coronation rituals, the pharaoh symbolically took Ra's place, promising to keep the cycles of sun, flood, and harvest intact. His legitimacy came not from newness, but from continuity. The worst sin for a king was not defeat, failing to keep order. Temples across Egypt functioned as miniature solar systems. Each morning, priests entered the sanctuary, opened the shrine containing the god's statue, washed and dressed it, lit lamps, and offered food. This was not worship in the modern sense, but maintenance. Priests were staff keeping the gods running. Much like Ra needed his crew in the solar bark. Every lamp lit, every sweep of the floor, every offering of bread was part of keeping the universe aligned. These rituals mirrored Ra's commute, just as he relied on spells to pass the gates of the Duat. Priests relied on correct incantations to open each stage of temple service. Nothing could be skipped. Each word, each act had weight to the Egyptians. Neglecting ritual risked cosmic collapse. Without constant attention, Ra's boat might falter, and the sun might not rise. Egyptians celebrated festivals tied to Ra's journey, often marking the solstices, when the sun reached its farthest points in the sky. One of the most significant was the Opet festival at Thebes, where the statue of Amun-Ra was carried from Karnak to Luxor Temple in a great procession. This festival renewed the king's divine mandate, paralleling the daily renewal of the sun. The festivals were not spontaneous celebrations, they were scheduled, calculated, and repeated each year with precision. Egyptians did not celebrate novelty but predictability as centuries passed. Ra's identity merged with other deities. Amu Unra. During the New Kingdom, Ra combined with Amun, the hidden god of Thebes, symbolizing both the visible sun and the invisible. Divine force. Rahorikdi, linked with Horus, emphasizing Ra's role as a horizon god. Radam, linked with Adam, representing the sun at evening, nearing completion of the cycle. These combinations reflected Egypt's evolving politics as local gods absorbed into Ra's mythology. Yet the core remained. Ra's cycle continued, day after day, night after night. Ra's endless commute expressed a philosophy of eternal return. The Egyptians did not believe in progress toward a final end. Time was not an arrow, but a circle. Each day was a recreation of the first sunrise. Each night was a repetition of Ra's struggle in the duat. Eternity was not endless change, but endless sameness to modern ears. This may sound monotonous. To the Egyptians, it was security. The world would not collapse as long as the cycle held. Repetition was stability, and stability was sacred. The tombs of kings were decorated with elaborate texts describing Ra's nightly journey. The Amduat detailed the 12 hours of the night. The Book of Gates described the guardians and thresholds he passed. The Book of Caverns emphasized the rewards and punishments of souls. These were not mere decoration. They were functional maps, ensuring the pharaoh could join Ra's boat after death. Each wall was a chart, each inscription a spell, each image a checkpoint. In this sense, tombs were not just burial places, they were commuter manuals for eternity. Despite the daily victory of sunrise, the Egyptians knew the system was fragile. Apophis was never destroyed. Chaos never vanished. Every dawn was proof not of permanence, but of vigilance. The priests had done their rituals, the spells had been recited, the order had held, but tomorrow the struggle would repeat. This worldview instilled both comfort and unease. Comfort in routine, unease in its fragility. Order could never be taken for granted. For ordinary Egyptians, Ra's journey was not distant. Farmers saw it in their own lives, plowing fields, planting seeds, harvesting crops, year after year. Mothers saw it in childbirth, raising children, who repeated their own lives. Priests saw it in the endless sweep of temple duties. Ra's commute was not just divine, it was human. Life itself was a series of repetitions, each sustaining the next. Egyptian paradise, the field of reeds, was modeled on this logic. There, the blessed dead plowed, harvested, and ate bread forever. It was not exciting. It was perfected routine. The Egyptians found beauty not in novelty, but in predictability. Eternity was not change it, was unchanging balance. So Ra's daily voyage was not a tale of drama, but of maintenance. His greatness lay not in triumph, but in persistence. Each morning he rose, each night he battled, each dawn he returned. And this raises a final question. If eternity itself is built on endless repetition, do we find comfort in the cyclore? Does the thought of unchanging routine reveal our own fear of boredom? Among all the gods of Egypt, few held as peculiar and yet essential a role as Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe of the divine. He was not a warrior, nor a ruler, nor a great cosmic force like Ra or Osiris. He was, instead, the god of writing, calculation, and administration. If Egyptian civilization is remembered for anything, it is its monumental record-keeping, the endless columns of hieroglyphs carved into stone, the papyrus scrolls filled with lists, contracts, prayers, and tax receipts. All of this, the paperwork of a civilization, was attributed to Thoth. He was the god of organization, the patron not of kings or farmers, but of scribes, with their reed pens and ink, P-A-L-E-T-T-E-S. It is no exaggeration to say that, without Thoth, Egyptian religion would collapse. For what is a ritual without words? What is law without records? What is mat, truth, and order without someone to write it all down? Thoth was most often depicted as a man with the head of an ibis, a long-beaked bird found along the Nile's shores. The ibis, with its meticulous movements as it picked through marshes, symbolized precision and calculation. Sometimes, Thoth appeared instead as a baboon, an animal that Egyptians observed, chattering at sunrise as though marking the hours of the day. In both forms, he represented measurement, recording, and the keeping of time. Thoth was not imposing. His power lay in patience, accuracy, and record-keeping. To Egyptians, these qualities were divine. The Egyptians believed that Thoth invented writing. Hieroglyphs, with their intricate combination of pictures and sounds, were gifts from him to humanity. With writing came the ability to preserve speech, to carry words across time and space. For the Egyptians, this was not just a convenience, but a miracle. Writing allowed prayers to be spoken long after the lips of the priest had stilled. It allowed contracts to bind the living and the dead. It allowed the names of kings to endure millennia, carved into stone. To write was to make something eternal. To erase writing was to destroy it utterly. Thus, scribes were not mere clerks. They were participants in the divine work of Thoth. Every grain counted, every tax recorded, every name inscribed was an act of cosmic order. Thoth's domain extended beyond writing to mathematics and measurement. He calculated the movement of stars, the length of months, and the cycle of the moon. He was credited with establishing the 365-day calendar, winning extra days from the moon so that Nut could give birth to her children. Numbers, for Thoth, were sacred. Each calculation was a defense against chaos. By measuring land after the Nile flood, Egyptians restored boundaries that had been washed away. By tracking lunar months, they set the rhythm of festivals and rituals. Every calculation was divine paperwork, ensuring that the fragile balance of Mat was maintained. In the Hall of Two Truths, when the heart of the deceased was weighed against Mat's feather, it was Thoth who recorded the result. He did not decide the outcome that was Osiris's role, but without Thoth's written word, the judgment had no permanence. The Egyptians trusted records above memory. A judgment unwritten could be forgotten or disputed, but a judgment written by Thoth was final, binding, eternal. In this sense, Thoth was not just a participant in the afterlife court, he was its foundation. Thoth's worship reflected the high esteem of scribes in Egyptian society. Scribes were among the most privileged professions. They did not toil in fields or fight in wars. Instead, they sat with ink and papyrus, recording harvests, contracts, temple rituals, and royal decrees. A famous text, the Satire of the Trades, praises the life of a scribe by mocking every other profession. The farmer's back bent in toil, the soldier's body wounded, the builder's hands blistered. The scribe, meanwhile, lived comfortably, his words carrying authority greater than swords. This exaltation of scribes was not just social, it was theological. To be a scribe was to participate in Thoth's divine work, ensuring the endurance of Mat. Thoth was also associated with the moon, the counterbalance to Ra's sun. Where the sun measured days, the moon measured months. Its waxing and waning provided another cycle, another form of order. In myth, Thoth restored the moon's eye after it was damaged in a cosmic struggle, ensuring its cycles remained steady. This reinforced his role as healer of balance, restorer of what was lost. The moon's calm, reflective light matched Thoth's character, quiet, measured, indirect, but essential. Thoth's main cult center was at Hermopolis, where priests dedicated themselves to preserving his wisdom. Unlike great temples to Ra or Amun, Hermopolis was not filled with massive pylons or dramatic statues. Its focus was knowledge, libraries, archives, and the careful transmission of texts. In Hermopolis, scribes copied and recopied sacred writings, preserving them through centuries. To them, every stroke of ink was sacred. It may seem strange to venerate a god of paperwork, but for the Egyptians, boredom was holy. The endless counting of grain, the measuring of fields, the copying of texts, these were the acts that preserved civilization. Thoth embodied this truth. Greatness does not always come from spectacle, but from diligence. His power was in the small, repetitive acts that ensured continuity. Without him, the rituals of priests could not be spoken. The laws of pharaohs could not be enforced. The memory of the dead could not endure. As you picture Thoth with his ibis head bent over a papyrus scroll, remember that to the Egyptians, this was the very image of eternity. Order is preserved not by grand victories, but by the quiet endurance of record-keeping, calculation, and ritual repetition. Thoth's divinity lay not in conquest, but in patience. He was the god of the boring details, and for that he was indispensable. But if all order depends on writing, what happens when writing itself is lost? What if the papyrus crumbles, or the stone is eroded, or the language forgotten? Can Mat endure without the scribe to record it? Thoth, the eye-besetted scribe of the gods, may seem at first like a divine secretary, quietly recording events, rather than shaping them. Yet, when one looks closer, his role expands beyond mere writing. He was not only the inventor of hieroglyphs, but also a magician, a mediator, and a cosmic problem solver. His pen was not passive, it was power. One of Thoth's most important duties was acting as mediator in divine disputes. where other gods fought with violence or passion. Thoth solved problems with persuasion, diplomacy, and words. In the myths of Osiris, Isis, and Horus, Thoth appears repeatedly to settle quarrels. When Horus and Set battled for the throne of Egypt, after Osiris's death, the conflict dragged on for decades. Neither strength nor cunning could resolve it. It was Thoth who offered counsel, recorded decisions, and ensured the gods did not tear the cosmos apart with endless fighting. Thoth's calm presence was essential. He did not take sides. He sought balance, the embodiment of Mat Thoth's. Magic was in speech and writing. Egyptians believed words had creative force. To name something was to give it existence. To inscribe a spell was to make it real. Thus, Thoth's mastery of language was a form of sorcery. He was called the master of spells, the god whose knowledge extended to every formula that could protect or harm. Magicians in Egypt invoked him constantly, borrowing his authority for their charms. If Isis was the mistress of cunning spells, Thoth was the lawful administrator of magic, ensuring it was recorded, structured, and reliable. One of Thoth's most famous roles was in the myth of Horus's eye. In his battles with Set, Horus lost his left eye. Thoth restored it, healing the wound and returning balance to Horus. This myth had profound symbolic meaning. The restored eye became the Wedget, or Eye of Horus, a symbol of protection, healing, and wholeness. Mathematically, the eye was divided into fractional parts, each representing aspects of knowledge: 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, 1/16, 1/32, 1/64, together. They nearly added up to one whole, reflecting the Egyptian idea that wholeness could be approached but never fully achieved. Thoth's restoration of the eye was not just mythology, was mathematical precision, order made flesh. As god of the moon, Thoth provided balance to Ra, the sun. While Ra blazed during the day, Thoth glowed softly at night. The moon was the counter-rhythm, the gentler half of timekeeping. This duality was important to Egyptians. The sun measured days and years. The moon measured months and religious festivals. Both were essential for agriculture, ritual. His light, the quiet reflection of order, even in darkness. At Hermopolis, Thoth was worshipped as part of the Ogdoad 8 primordial deities, representing the chaotic waters before creation. Here, he was not merely a scribe, but a cosmic principle, associated with the first ordering of the universe. In this role, Thoth was said to have spoken the words that called the first mound of earth into being, or to have directed the rising of the sun with his calculations. Thus, he was not only recorder of creation, but participant in it, ensuring chaos became cosmos through the power of language and mathematics. Thoth's presence in the afterlife was not limited to recording the weighing of the heart. He also mediated between Osiris, the dead king, and the newly arrived souls. If disputes arose, Thoth ensured fairness. He was the clerk of eternity, guaranteeing that every soul's record was accurate, that no mistake in ritual or speech would doom the innocent. His pen was as powerful as Osiris's throne in some myths. Thoth appears as a counterpart to Set, while Set embodied brute force and chaos. Yet, paradoxically, both were necessary. Set defended Ra's solar boat against Apophis with violence. Thoth defended it with spells and guidance. This reflected Egyptian pragmatism. Even chaos could serve order, as long as it was managed. Rivalry with Set was not destruction, but balance to forces needed to keep Ra's journey safe. Egyptian magicians and healers constantly invoked Thoth in their spells. To treat illness, they recited words written by Thoth. To protect children, they called upon his authority. To curse enemies, they claimed his formulas. Texts preserved on papyri show that scribes credited their incantations to him, as if borrowing divine authorship. In this way, Thoth's divinity filtered directly into daily life, through charms worn by peasants and rituals performed in homes. It is important to understand that writing itself was magical. Inscriptions carved into tombs or papyrus were not mere records of, they were performative acts. To inscribe a prayer ensured it was eternally spoken. To inscribe a curse made it real. Thoth, as inventor of writing, was therefore the most dangerous and most protective god at once. He gave humanity the ability to fix words permanently. He also reminded them that once written, words could not be taken back. Looking at Thoth's role, one sees Egypt itself, a civilization built not only on pyramids and statues, but on paperwork. Lists of offerings, rolls of workers, legal contracts, calendars of festivals. Thoth was the divine embodiment of this bureaucracy. His sandals did not tread battlefields, but temple floors. His pen maintained the empire as surely as Pharaoh's armies. In this sense, Thoth represents the boring miracle of Egypt, that order is preserved not by drama, but by repetition, records, and routine. When you picture Thoth, do not see a thunderbolt or a sword. See an ibis bending its long beak with patience. See a scribe hunched over papyrus, ink staining his fingers. See the moon calm and steady, casting light on the Nile at night. Thoth's greatness lay not in spectacle, but in endurance, in the slow, quiet accumulation of knowledge. But if knowledge itself is divine, who controls it? Thoth gave humanity writing and spells, but could mortals use this power to upset Mat rather than preserve it? Did writing guarantee order? Did it risk chaos if misused? Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe, was not a warrior god or a ruler king. His power was quieter, but no less vital. He embodied the idea that knowledge, words, and careful record-keeping were the foundations of order. As Egypt endured for over 3,000 years, it was this legacy more than conquest that gave it permanence for Egyptians. Wisdom itself was personified in Thoth. He was not simply clever. He was the container of knowledge, the one who measured, calculated, and recorded all things. The Greeks, when they later encountered Egyptian thought, equated Thoth with Hermes, their messenger, god of wisdom and communication. In doing so, they created Hermes Trismegistus, a figure who became legendary in Hellenistic and later Renaissance philosophy as the supposed author of mystical writings about the cosmos. Thus, Thoth's image extended far beyond Egypt, shaping Western traditions of magic, philosophy, and alchemy. In myths, Thoth often served as lawgiver. When disputes arose, it was he who wrote the decrees. When cosmic order needed articulation, it was Thoth who recorded it. This was no small role. In Egyptian culture, the written word was stronger than spoken authority. A pharaoh might declare a law, but it was the scribe's inscription that gave it permanence. Without writing, Even the most powerful decree dissolved into air. Thoth, then, was the guarantor of law. He made the temporary eternal. Legends spoke of a mysterious book of Thoth, a collection of spells and knowledge written by the god himself. It was said that anyone who read it would gain mastery over earth, sky, sea, and even the gods. But the legends also warned of danger. Those who sought the book often faced curses, madness, or death. Knowledge was power, but power misused led to ruin. This reflects the Egyptian ambivalence toward writing. It preserved order, but it could also unlock dangerous secrets. The same hieroglyphs that blessed a tomb could curse a thief. Thoth was credited with inventing mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Medical papyri, such as the Ebers papyrus, contain not only remedies but also spells invoking Thoth. Healing was never purely physical in Egypt. It was bound to words, incantations, and ritual. To recite a spell written by Thoth was to participate in divine healing. Astronomers, too, saw their work as his domain. By charting the stars, they followed Thoth's calculations. By measuring the Nile flood, they enacted his precision. Ra, the blazing sun, was the visible god of kings and daylight. But Ra could not dominate. Thoth's moonlight balanced him, providing order in the night. This duality reflected Egyptian philosophy. Balance required complementarity. Just as Nut needed Geb and Mat required Isfet, so too did the sun need the moon. Thoth was not rival to Ra, but counterweight, the quiet balance to loud brilliance. Perhaps Thoth's greatest legacy was the invention of writing. Hieroglyphs carved in tombs were not decoration, but acts of preservation. They kept names alive, ensuring the dead were remembered. To Egyptians, to write a name was to grant immortality. To erase a name was to condemn the soul to oblivion. This belief made writing a sacred weapon. Pharaohs who fell from favor, such as Hatshepsut or Akhenaten, had their names chiseled out of monuments, erasing their afterlife. Thoth's gift was double-edged, writing preserved forever. But it could also destroy. In the afterlife, Thoth's role as recorder of judgment gave him the final word on truth. Even Osiris's rulings needed his inscription to become binding. The heart might balance against the feather of Mat, but without Thoth's hand to write the verdict, the judgment was incomplete. In this way, he was not simply scribe, he was the arbiter of eternity. His quill was as sharp as any sword Egyptians saw. Thoth, not as distant, but as reflected in every scribe hunched over papyrus. Students in scribal schools prayed to him for skill. Bureaucrats counted grain in his name. Priests copied hymns as if imitating his divine handwriting. Even in the smallest village, a contract written on papyrus carried Thoth's shadow. He was the god not of kings alone, but of ordinary administration, of the boring paperwork that kept the state alive. Thoth represents a truth Egyptians held sacred. Survival depends not on glory, but on routine. The boring details, the count of grain, the measure of time, the copying of prayers, were what preserved Mat. It was not exciting, but it was eternal. The gods of battle might win glory, but Thoth's pen outlasted them all. And so, Thoth's story concludes not with conquest, but with quiet endurance. He was the god of records, the patron of scribes, the counterweight of Ra, the healer of Horus's eye, the mediator in disputes, the inventor of writing itself. His greatness lay in the small, repetitive acts that preserved civilization. Without him, the rituals of priests, the judgments of Osiris, the decrees of King Zal would vanish into air. But this leaves us with a question. If knowledge and writing preserve eternity, what happens when no one can read the words? When languages die and papyrus turns to dust? Does Thoth's order endure? Does silence reclaim what was once carefully recorded? If Ra gave Egypt its light, and Thoth gave it its words, then Osiris gave it its life. He was not merely a god of death, as he is often remembered today. He was first and foremost a god of fertility, of the earth's renewal, of the cycles that allowed Egypt to eat and survive. In Abydos, festivals of Osiris reenacted these events. Priests and lay people alike mourned his death with laments, then celebrated his resurrection with songs of joy. Processions carried his image on the Nile, echoing his coffin's journey. The rituals were repetitive, predictable, and necessary. They reassured Egyptians that the cycle would continue, that Set's desert would never triumph forever, that Osiris would rise with the floodwaters. As you hear this story, imagine the farmer watching the Nile shrink, fearing the desert creeping closer. Imagine him planting seed, whispering prayers to Osiris, trusting that the god would return in the flood. Imagine the family mourning a death, believing that just as Osiris rose, so too would their loved one rise in the field of reeds. Osiris's myth was their mirror, their reassurance, their survival. But here a question lingers. If Osiris depends on Isis's devotion to rise again, what happens when devotion fails? If offerings are neglected, if rituals lapse, if memory fades, does Osiris still return? Or does Set's desert win in the end? The myth of Osiris is more than the story of a god's death and rebirth. It is the foundation of Egyptian kingship, funerary practice, and the belief in eternity. His body was the land, his death the harvest, his resurrection the flood, and his throne the very idea of rulership. To speak of Osiris was to speak of Egypt itself. In Egyptian tradition, Osiris was remembered as Egypt's first ruler, a divine king who governed with justice, introduced agriculture, and gave laws. His reign was the ideal of Mat, stability, nourishment, and harmony. When Set murdered him, it was more than fratricide, it was the disruption of kingship itself. His death mirrored the constant threat that chaos posed to pharaohs, the possibility that order could collapse, that abundance could give way to barrenness. But Osiris's resurrection restored kingship to eternity. From then on, every pharaoh claimed to be the living Horus, son of Osiris, and upon death to become Osiris himself. Kingship was not individual, it was cyclical, a sacred office passed through generations, tied to the eternal rhythm of fertility. This dual identity defined Egyptian rulership in life. The pharaoh was Horus, falcon, god of kingship, avenger of Osiris, guardian of order. In death, the pharaoh became Osiris, ruler of the underworld, guarantor of resurrection. Thus, kingship itself was a cycle. The living king upheld the land, and the dead king guaranteed the afterlife. No ruler was permanent, but the institution endured. Isis's devotion to Osiris became the model of royal and personal piety. Queens were identified with her, playing the role of protectors and restorers of their husband's legacy. In every household, women reenacted Isis's role, mourning, healing, and ensuring continuity. This elevated not only the goddess, but also the everyday labor of women in sustaining families and farms. Isis's magic was not spectacle, but diligence. Finding the pieces, reassembling them, whispering the words of renewal. Every Egyptian burial was an imitation of Osiris's resurrection. The mummification process itself echoed the reassembly of his body. Priests wrapped limbs carefully, spoke spells of protection, and placed amulets to preserve wholeness. Coffins were painted with green faces, symbolizing Osiris's fertility. Tombs were stocked with food, tools, and figurines to ensure survival in the afterlife. Just as Osiris continued to reign after death, to die in Egypt was to enter Osiris's story. To be buried was to be planted like grain. With the promise of rising again, Osiris's kingdom was not a distant heaven, but a perfected Egypt, the field of reeds, where the blessed dead plowed and harvested forever. This vision reflected the agricultural heart of Egyptian life. Eternity was not luxury or leisure, but endless fertility fields without drought, harvests without hunger, work without exhaustion. It was paradise through predictability. Osiris's promise was not adventure, but stability. To live under him was to know that the cycles of planting and harvest would never fail. The worship of Osiris spread across Egypt and beyond. Temples at Abydos became pilgrimage centers, where Egyptians of all classes hoped to be associated with him in death. Even modest households carved Osirian prayers on tombs, aligning themselves with his cycle. In later periods, Greeks and Romans encountered his cult and merged him with their own gods. Yet his agricultural meaning remained intact. Osiris was life through death, grain through burial, order through renewal. Osiris embodied Mat not through judgment like the scales of the afterlife, but through rhythm. His myth reassured Egyptians that the universe was not linear but cyclical, that death was not final but a stage in continuity. His resurrection was not unique, it was the model for all. Just as the Nile returned, just as crops sprouted, so too would the soul endure. Modern eyes may find Osiris's promise unremarkable. Eternal farming, perpetual harvests, repetition without end. But for Egyptians, this was the highest ideal. The boredom of cycles was not disparate, was comfort. In a land where drought could bring death, stability was salvation. The idea that the same harvest would repeat forever was paradise itself. Osiris was the god of predictable boredom, and that was precisely why he mattered most. Yet the myth also acknowledged fragility. Set's violence was never fully defeated. The desert always lurked at the edges of the Nile Valley. Crops might fail, floods might falter. The Egyptians knew the cycle could collapse if rituals were neglected. Thus, every festival, every prayer, every burial was an act of maintenance, renewing Osiris's body, ensuring his resurrection, preserving the fragile balance of fertility. The story of Osiris is not one of spectacle, but of survival. His death at Set's hands was the dry season, his scattering the loss of fertility, his reassembly the return of crops, his reign in the afterlife the assurance of eternal renewal to live. In Egypt was to live Osiris's story daily. To plant was to bury him, To harvest was to resurrect him. To die was to join him. His myth was the agricultural calendar itself, written in water, soil, and grain. And so the Egyptians asked themselves, if Osiris could always rise again, would they too? Was eternity not a distant dream, but the familiar boredom of endless planting, endless harvest, endless life under the green-skinned god? In the hush of eternity, when an Egyptian soul entered the Hall of Two Truths, the judgment was not delivered in silence. It was spoken, carefully, formulaically, in the form of denial. I have not stolen. I have not lied. I have not polluted the Nile. I have not slain the sacred cattle. These statements, 42 in total, were known as the negative confessions, or the declarations of innocence. They formed the moral code of ancient Egypt, not as commandments issued from on high, but as a checklist, a list of ordinary denials recited before the judges of the dead. The Egyptians believed that judgment in the afterlife was not delivered by one god alone. Instead, it was overseen by a panel of 42 divine judges, each representing one of Egypt's provinces or nomes. Each judge had authority over a specific sin. To one, the soul declared, I have not committed theft. To another, I have not spoken falsehoods. To another, I have not polluted water. This was morality in bureaucratic form. Just as scribes and officials kept track of grain, labor, and taxes, so too did the gods keep track of human conduct. Every aspect of life was overseen, every action measured. Unlike other moral codes, the negative confessions were not commands, but denials. They did not say, do not steal, but I have not stolen. This subtle difference reveals much about Egyptian thought. The confessions were not about hypothetical rules, but about actual record. They were retrospective audits, like a ledger of one's life. At the moment of judgment, the soul was not asked to obey, but to account. The confessions are striking for their focus on ordinary acts. They do not forbid extraordinary crimes or demand heroic deeds. Instead, they emphasize the daily conduct of life, honesty in trade, fairness in labor, respect for property, care for the natural world. The sins were mundane because life was mundane. Egyptian morality was not built on extremes, but on balance. A just person was not a saint or a warrior, but someone who lived fairly within the cycles of community and nature. Many confessions concerned the Nile and the land. I have not polluted water. I have not diminished the offerings to the gods. I have not destroyed crops. This shows how deeply morality was tied to survival. To pollute the Nile was not merely a crime, it was an attack on life itself. To neglect offerings was not. Mere impity was a threat to the cosmic order that sustained fertility. Egyptian ethics were inseparable from ecology. To live justly was to live in harmony with the river, the soil, and the gods who embodied them. At the heart of the confessions was Mat, the principle of truth and balance. Each denial was not just a legal statement, but a claim to alignment. With Mat, the confessions functioned like weights on a scale. Each one declared innocence, lightening the heart, bringing it closer to the feather of Mat. The accumulation of these denials was a ritual of balance, an effort to tip eternity toward survival. In the afterlife, the soul was expected to recite the confessions one by one, addressing each judge by name. This required knowledge and precision. Funerary texts, such as the Book of the Dead, included lists of the judges and their corresponding confessions, ensuring the deceased could speak correctly. This was not improvisation, it was liturgy. The words were formulaic, unchanged across generations. They were less about sincerity and more about ritual precision. Yet the Egyptians believed words had power. To say, "I have not stolen," was not just speech, but magical declaration. If spoken correctly, it became truth. Binding on the cosmos, later religions would create commandments, absolute prohibitions, and moral laws, but the Egyptian confessions were different. They were not abstract ideals, but practical audits, tied to the realities of farming, trade, and ritual. Where commandments demanded obedience, confessions demanded accountability. They were less about what one ought to do, and more about what one could claim to have done or not done at the end of life. To modern ears, the list can sound tedious. 42 denials, one after another, covering petty theft, false witness, impiety, and pollution. But for Egyptians, this boredom was sacred. The repetition reinforced the idea that morality was not dramatic, but daily. Justice was not about extraordinary heroism, but about ordinary honesty. Each denial was a brick in the wall of order, boring, but necessary to keep chaos at bay. Imagine yourself standing before the 42 judges, reciting each denial carefully, like reading from a checklist. Imagine the silence of the hall, the sound of your own voice declaring, "I have not lied, I have not stolen, I have not polluted water." This was Egyptian morality, procedural, repetitive, bureaucratic, yet profoundly meaningful. It was the moral mirror of their civilization, measured, audited, recorded. But this raises an unease. If morality was a matter of recitation, could a skilled tongue escape justice? Could someone who lived unjustly still pass by speaking the formulas correctly? Or did the heart itself betray, outweighing words, no matter how carefully recited? Negative confessions were more than religious formulas. They were the intersection of morality, politics, and daily life. To understand them is to understand how Egyptians conceived of justice, not as an abstract philosophy, but as a system of checks and balances. Embedded in both society and the cosmos, Egypt was divided into 42 nomes, or administrative provinces. Each had its local deity, officials, and responsibilities. The 42 judges of the afterlife court mirrored this division. Thus, the confessions were not only spiritual but political. By addressing each judge, the deceased symbolically addressed each region of Egypt, declaring innocence before the entire nation. It was as if the whole state, through its divine representatives, audited the soul. This reinforced unity. The afterlife judgment reflected the earthly bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy reflected cosmic order. To be innocent before the judges was to be innocent before Egypt itself. The pharaoh, as upholder of Maat, was responsible for ensuring that Egyptians lived in alignment with these moral expectations. Royal decrees often emphasized fairness in grain distribution, punishment of corruption, and respect for temples, all reflections of the confessions. Pharaoh's justice was not arbitrary, but tied to the same standards that judged ordinary souls. In theory, even kings were measured by Maat's feather. This ideal linked personal morality to state stability. A corrupt official was not just a criminal, he was a threat to Maat, and thus a cosmic danger. The confessions were mirrored. In earthly courts, where scribes recorded testimonies, contracts, and judgments, just as Thoth recorded the weighing of the heart, scribes inscribed human disputes, ensuring permanence. Egyptian trials often involved oaths invoking Mat. A witness might swear, "By Mat, I have spoken truth." To lie under such an oath was to risk not only earthly punishment, but eternal condemnation. The bureaucratic nature of morality meant that every record, every contract, every inscription was a rehearsal for the afterlife trial. The list of sins reveals what society most feared: theft, agriculture, and survival, violence against sacred animals, threatened ritual continuity, disrespect of temples, threatened the stability of the gods. Favor by embedding these concerns into the afterlife, the state ensured compliance. Morality was not voluntary, it was eternal. Even if one escaped punishment in life, one could not escape in death. The confessions, then, were both religious reassurance and political control, binding every Egyptian to a system of accountability. For most Egyptians, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, the confessions were not distant theology, but familiar duties. A farmer irrigating his field remembered, "I have not withheld water from my neighbor's land." A trader measuring grain remembered, "I have not cheated with false weights." A fisherman casting nets remembered, "I have not taken fish consecrated to the gods." These were not extraordinary demands, but the rules of daily survival. Morality was lived not in temples alone, but in markets, workshops, and fields. Yet there was a paradox. Egyptians also believed that correct recitation of the confessions, guided by funerary texts, could secure salvation. Even a sinner, if properly buried with the right spells, might pass the test. This tension reveals a deep anxiety. Was morality a matter of genuine conduct or of ritual precision? Was justice determined by deeds or by words? The heart scarab amulet, placed on mummies, included a spell begging the heart not to betray its owner. "Do not stand against me as witness. Do not weigh heavy against me." This suggests Egyptians feared that words alone might not suffice. The 42 confessions are tedious to read in sequence, one denial after another, formulaic, repetitive, but this boredom was itself meaningful. The Egyptians believed that stability came from repetition. Just as Ra's sun rose daily, just as Osiris died and rose yearly, so too morality was confirmed not by drama, but by endless rehearsal. The monotony of the list mirrored the monotony of life itself. To them, boredom was sacred. To declare 42 times "I have not" was to build a wall of order, brick by brick, denial by denial, against the encroachment of chaos. Later, moral systems, like the Ten Commandments or the Greek philosophical virtues, emphasized ideals and commands. Egypt's confessions were different. They were pragmatic, provincial, and procedural. Instead of "Thou shalt not kill," the Egyptian soul said, "I have not killed unjustly." Instead of "Thou shalt not covet," the Egyptian said, "I have not stolen temple goods." The focus was less on universal morality and more on practical accountability within Egypt's ecological and social system. As you picture the Hall of Two Truths, imagine the soul reciting these denials one by one, addressing each judge, like a farmer explaining himself to 42 officials. The scene is not fiery or dramatic, it is quiet, procedural, almost bureaucratic. Yet, in this boredom lies reassurance. Morality was not unreachable, not lofty, but lived daily in fairness, honesty, and respect for the land. But the tension remains. If morality could be recited as a formula, did the ritual outweigh genuine deeds? Could a corrupt man, properly buried, escape judgment through words? Or did the feather of Mat always reveal the truth, no matter how eloquently spoken? The negative confessions endure as one of the most distinctive moral codes of the ancient world. Unlike the fiery punishments of later religions, or the abstract ideals of philosophy, they present a vision of morality as administration, a set of denials recited like items on a ledger, a checklist against chaos. This bureaucratic morality shaped Egypt's courts, politics, and afterlife beliefs for centuries, and its legacy continues to echo, subtly but persistently, in how humanity thinks about justice in the afterlife. The Hall of Two Truths was less a battlefield than a courtroom. The 42 judges resembled provincial officials, each hearing testimony relevant to their jurisdiction. Thoth acted as the divine clerk, Osiris as the presiding magistrate. The soul was not asked for bravery, or sacrifices, or feats of heroism. It was asked to speak clearly, to make denials in order, to satisfy the bureaucracy of eternity. This mirrored the earthly courts of Egypt, where disputes were settled by oaths, witnesses, and scribes. Justice was not spectacular. It was procedural. For Egyptians, words were not empty statements. To speak was to act. To inscribe was to make permanent. Thus, the negative confessions were more than denials. They were magical utterances. If spoken correctly, they shaped reality. To declare "I have not stolen" was to align oneself with Mat, even if the truth was otherwise. This faith in words reveals the duality of Egyptian morality. Conduct mattered, but so did ritual precision. The line between ethics and magic was blurred. The confessions were often preserved in funerary texts, such as the Book of the Dead. These scrolls acted as manuals for the deceased, ensuring they knew the correct order of recitation. This reveals a profound anxiety that even if one lived well, one might falter in memory or precision. Ritual ensured success where human weakness might fail. Yet, the presence of heart scarab amulets, inscribed with spells begging the heart not to testify against its owner, shows that Egyptians knew the truth could not always be hidden. The heart was heavier than words.